Good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Gustavo Martinez. I belong to the GeneXus Research and Development team. I'm in the reporting area. Today, I want to talk to you about a technological marvel that is revolutionizing the way we access information. I am referring to chatbots and access to data in databases using artificial intelligence. Imagine a world in which, for instance, we can access organizational data, the relevant data, not just with one click, but in a much more natural way, as if we were talking to a friend. That sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Well, at this moment, starting from now, in this talk, we are going to dive into the fantastic universe of what accessing data using intelligent conversations entails. Yesterday, in Eugenio Garcia's talk, we showed an overview of what GeneXus Enterprise AI is. In a nutshell, it is a platform developed by GeneXus to centralize the construction of artificial intelligence assistants that are used to various user requirements. The assistants allow us to do various types of things. For instance, we can set a prompt to interact with a language model from an artificial intelligence provider, asking it questions in text format and receiving a text response in return. Or we can ask it to build an image for us. We can also do it as Gonzalo showed. Luciano is going to give a talk about it, how to upload documents from a certain area, for example, legal, and then make queries about those documents. Or we can use them to go against the database and ask questions, queries in natural language. And also ask questions, queries in natural language about the data that is stored. And this is what we are going to be talking about in this talk. While GeneXus has been marketing for years a tool with a similar idea, which is GXQuery. The idea of GXQuery has always been to give the end user the possibility to make their queries, and at the same time, to free the development team from this task. The power of GXQuery is based on two main points: the knowledge stored in its metadata, which allows abstracting everything, that is, tables, relationships between tables, and hide it from the user, and the query generation engine, which allows, given a query specification, to build a SQL statement that solves the query. It solves it, executes it, and presents the result to the user. But the user still has to know how to build this query. If I, for example, am going to use parameters, I have to know what they are, how to use them. Or if I want to put a formula in the query, I have to know the syntax of that formula, or how to display a table or a graph. Or if I want to put a title, for example, to the graph, what property I have to touch to put that title. It would be much better, much easier, if I could give all these instructions to the tool in a much more natural way. And if we manage to do this, what we are going to do is to eliminate forever the barrier of adoption of the tool and make the tool accessible not only to the most advanced users and the skilled users, but to all the users of the organization. And it's with this barrier removal in mind that we decided to combine the power of GXQuery metadata with the artificial intelligence chats of GeneXus Enterprise AI, and to package it all together in the form of an assistant that we call the Chat with Data, with GXQuery behind. Before we continue, I am going to show you a video, a preview of what we can do with these types of assistants. This is the GeneXus Enterprise AI Playground. At the top left, we have selected an assistant of this type, and we are going to start chatting. I'm going to ask it, for example, in the text box, the population by continent in a graph. And the wizard interprets this sentence in natural language, converts it into a GXQuery query, and displays the result. Now that we know what we can ask of this type of wizard, let's see what we have behind it. What we are seeing here is the architecture in a very summarized way. The first thing we did was to convert GXQuery into a REST API. GXQuery was, until the previous version, a monolithic application. That is to say, user interface, business logic, and data access, all in the same application. From now on, access to GXQuery functionality will be only through the REST API. Well, this involved a re-engineering of the tool, the identification of the access points needed for the functionality needed by the wizard, moving controls from the UI to the API, and all these changes with backwards compatibility in mind, because I want GXQuery users from previous versions to be able to export their metadata and then import it into this new version without any problems. Underneath what is the REST API of GXQuery, not much has changed there. GXQuery still has its database where the metadata are cataloged, and for each one of those metadata, I have a GeneXus knowledge base, and GXQuery relies on the GeneXus BL for everything that is the creation of queries. I mean queries in these knowledge bases and for the generation of the SQL statement. When I talk about the GXQuery API and the REST API, but it's actually several APIs that give me access to various types of resources. We have, for example, the session services that allow me to start a session, to log out, to query the list of active sessions, to see if my session is still active. We have the metadata services, which is everything that is adding, deleting, or modifying metadata, importing knowledge into a metadata. To export a metadata, put it online, put it offline. We have the data store services, which is everything that has to do with the database that contains the data that I'm actually going to consult. And there, I have services to configure the connection options, to test a connection, that kind of thing. We have the security services, which is basically to create, delete users, also roles, assign users to roles, define permissions, more or less that. We have the query services, which allow me to create and delete queries. When I say create, make new queries, it is using natural language, which is what we are talking about in this talk. They allow you to set properties, read properties, export queries. The execution services, which is the actual execution part of the query itself, are a series of services. All the output types have at least 2 calls to get the query metadata, to get the data, but depending on the output, I choose, for example, the pivot table and make some additional calls. We have the file part, which is primarily for uploading and downloading files from the server, and the system part, which is, well, general properties configuration of the tool. Let's focus now a little bit on this service of creating a new query. This service receives a text in natural language. For example, what it says there is to show in a column chart the top 5 countries by GDP per capita in Europe. Using a prompt, with a prompt of GeneXus Enterprise AI, this service converts this representation of the query, in this case in English, into a structured version of the same query, which follows a certain syntax. This syntax is the one that, for example, if I have a KB with query and I open it with GeneXus for web, is the one I see when I open a query. It starts with the word query, followed by the name of the query, then a list of properties, and then several sections. The first is a list of properties and then several sections. The first of these is the list of query elements, which can be attributes or formulas. Then a part of, which here in this example is not, but a part of parameters with delimiters. Where goes the list of parameters? Properties of these parameters, if required. a section of filters, and a section of order, where I tell you the attributes by which to order the tuples of the result. And let's move on now to see what is the life cycle, if you will, of a query. I have the playground of GeneXus Enterprise AI, which is the user interface where the user chats, which is where I enter, for example, a requirement. Give me, as in the example, the population by continent in a graph. The playground, the first thing it does is to call the GXQuery REST API to the new query service, passing it this request, and GXQuery solves the query and returns an object representing the query, which is taken by the query viewer, which is an integral part of the playground. And the query viewer starts the execution, calling, as I mentioned a little while ago, in principle to two services, which is to obtain the metadata and the query data. And then it displays the result in the playground. And what happens if the query is not exactly what I expected? The tool may have misunderstood, or I may have made a mistake and didn't ask it, right? Well, this is just a chat. What I do is enter a new message, let's say, in the chat, asking for the change I want. And then the cycle starts all over again. The previous query is discarded, a new one is created, the query viewer is passed to it to execute, it is executed and displayed. And in this cycle, I stay until I actually have the query as I wanted it. And at that point there, I see if it was a punctual doubt at the moment that I discard it for later. But if it is a query that is good and I want to execute it again today or tomorrow, I save it and it is cataloged along with the rest of the queries within the metadata of GXQuery. Now that we more or less know what's on the back end, let's see what I have to do starting from my database, whatever it is. What are the steps I have to do to get everything put together, to be able to query this data and show graphs, show tables, cards, etc. The first thing I need, what I have to have, is a logical model of my database. If I made my database with GeneXus, the knowledge base is already that logical model. But if not, if it is any database, what I have to do is to go through a reverse engineering process to build that logical model. GeneXus has a tool called Database Reverse Engineering Tool, which does just this job. Let's open GeneXus and go to the tools. Let's select Database Reverse Engineering Tool. The first thing the tool asks me is the connection data. There it is, a database that is in the cloud. I put in the connection data, and when I press next, the tool shows me the list of tables that are in that database, where I am allowed to select which tables are going to be the ones that I'm going to integrate with my logical model. When I press next, it shows me a summary of what it's going to be, where I can make changes, in this case not. And when I press finish, the tool builds in the knowledge base the list of transactions that represent the logical model of my database. The next thing I have to do is to generate the metadata for GXQuery. For that, I will go back to Tools, GXQuery, the option Create New Metadata. And here I'm going to generate a file that in the next step, I'm going to have to upload. I'm going to have to pull it up. I can select transactions at this point. In this case, I'm going to leave them all. With the file that I just generated, I'm going to go to the GeneXus Enterprise AI backoffice. This is to create an assistant with the contents of this file. Well, I log in, I go to the assistant's path. There is an option to create a chat with data type assistant. I go and select this file that I just generated, and there, when I save it, it asks me for a name for the assistant. It has no name. I'm going to name it Chat with Enterprise Data. I confirm. At this point, the assistant is created. The only thing left to do is to configure the connection with the data, for which I will edit the assistant, go to the data store part and enter the connection options, which are the same as the ones we started the demo with. I'm going to configure the server, I'm going to configure the database and the credentials. And while I have everything ready to start chatting with my data and make queries, for that, we are going to go to the playground. The playground, as I showed you in the first video, it is the end user interface. It's a chat interface where I'm going to enter my queries. I have the list of wizards on the left. At the top, I have selected the wizard that I just created, and I'm going to start chatting. For example, I'm going to ask it to show me in a pie chart the top 10 countries that had the most deaths in the COVID pandemic. The base I am using is of information referring to the pandemic, and also statistical information of countries. This query shows it to me. It has a title. If I want to change it, I tell it. It is simply to tell it the title of the chart is such. And with that, it changes the title. If I don't want a title, I say I don't want the title, and the title disappears. For example, another example. I want to show the rate of male and female smokers by continent in a chart. And the tool interprets this query that I give it in English and shows me the result. In the example, there is no title on the y-axis. Well, to put the title is simply to say, put the title on the y-axis that is such. And the tool shows me the graph with the title. I want, for example, the list of countries by GDP per capita in descending order. I ask it in the chat, and the tool makes the query, executes it, and shows me the list of countries in descending order. If I want to change the order, for example, in ascending order, I simply say, now show it to me in ascending order and remove all the numbers, all the values that are there. And the query is modified to cater to what I just asked it to do. There are other types of output, for example, card. Here, I want to show you in a card the smoking rate in Uruguay, separately for men and women. And here you show it to me. And if I want to ask another country, for example, I tell it Argentina, it changes the filter value and runs the same query, but for a different country. One last example, for example, number of cases per day in Uruguay during the year 2021. In a graph and the tool, I make this query and it shows me. And if I want another year, it is simply to ask naturally, and during the 2020, and then the graph is modified, the filter value is modified, and it shows me the data for that value. This is fantastic. We want it to be available not only in the tool in GeneXus Enterprise AI, but also for all users who build applications using the GeneXus development platform. That is why we are thinking of a series of user controls to have all this power that we have just demonstrated in GeneXus applications. We are thinking of a user control that allows chatting, which is basically for the entry of messages. A user control to display the query. Actually, this user control already exists. It is the traditional query viewer. Only now, in addition to using it to show queries defined in my knowledge base defined in my knowledge base, I can use it to show queries, connect through services to GXQuery, and show queries saved in GXQuery. And also, for another control, to manage the queries that I have saved, to see the list, for example, to select one, to send it to execute, or to change the name, to delete it, and all that sort of things. This is more or less what I had to show you in this talk. I just wanted to thank you for attending. I also invite you to register to try this tool. So I'm here for any questions you may have. Thank you very much again.